On a sunny, brisk day on September 6, 1992, a group of Alaskan moose hunters walked along a secluded area known as the Stampede Trail. As it was getting dark, they stumbled upon an old transit bus and, thinking that might make a good shelter for the night, they opened the door and climbed inside. They were immediately repelled by a horrific smell inside and, fearing the worst, they contacted police. The ensuing investigation uncovered the fascinating and very tragic story of a 24-year-old man named Christopher McCandless. Chris McCandless was born on February 12, 1968 in Inglewood, California. From a young age, he was an incredibly bright and energetic young man, and he showed a growing interest in outdoor adventure. He read the works of Mark Twain and Jack London religiously and jumped at any opportunity to go camping with his family. Chris was the oldest child of Marie and Walt McCandless. While there were small flickers of peace, Chris's upbringing was not a happy one. Walt was alcoholic and physically abusive towards the entire family. While his mother Marie was never physically abusive, she was a deceitful woman and viewed her children as a burden, trapping her in the prison that was her life. Chris's sister Corinne remembers that Chris frequently voiced the desire to escape into the wilderness, an impulse no doubt motivated by their abusive upbringing. In addition to Corinne, Chris also had 6 half-siblings from Walt's previous marriage, something that was hidden for many years. In 1976, Walt accepted a job as an antenna specialist for NASA and moved the family to Annandale, Virginia. Marie found a job as a secretary for the Hughes Aircraft Company. A few years after moving to Virginia, the couple realized that with Walt's subject matter expertise and Marie's organizational skills, they actually made a great team. They went on to form a successful consulting business in Walt's field. As Chris grew up, he became more at odds with his parents and their materialistic view of the world. He had no interest in the sickening routine of middle-class American life and longed to live a more meaningful existence. Chris graduated from Woodson High School in 1986, and against his parents' wishes, he took a road trip to California that summer to reconnect with childhood friends. It was there that he learned about his father's previous marriage. He also learned that Walt had fathered a child with his ex-wife after his marriage to Marie. This infuriated Chris and had a deep impact on him, but he kept quiet and never brought it up with his parents. Chris graduated from Emory University in 1990 with a double major in history and anthropology. His grades were more than good enough to get into any law school he wanted, and that was the path that his parents expected him to take. Then suddenly, in the summer of 1990, Chris disappeared, seemingly off the face of the earth. He didn't answer his parents' many phone calls and letters, and they became very worried. The only scrap of information they could find was a record from an Atlanta charity showing that Chris had donated all $24,000 of his savings. Walt and Marie wouldn't learn the truth of their son for another 2 long years. In July 1990, Chris left Atlanta, where he had attended college, in his yellow 1982 Datsun and headed west. The car was in bad shape and broke down frequently along the trip. He also had expired license plates and no insurance. By the end of the summer, he reached the Lake Mead recreational area in Arizona, where his car was destroyed by a flash flood. Fearing he would be arrested due to a lack of documentation, Chris removed the vehicle's license plates, packed up what he could carry, and continued his adventure on foot. Interestingly enough, his vehicle was later found, repaired, and put into service as an undercover vehicle for the local police department. In early 1991, Chris hitchhiked into the Sierra Nevada mountain region, where he stayed in hermit camps with other nomads for several months. He had a deep impact on everyone he met and often shared his desire to escape from society. Chris continued his journey to California, then Arizona, and eventually north to South Dakota. Completely out of cash, he found a job working for a farmer named Wayne Westerberg. He worked with Wayne for several months and formed a close friendship with him too. Citing a need for new adventure, Chris returned south in the summer of 1991 and used his hard-earned cash to purchase kayak supplies. He took off down the Colorado River without a permit and hotly pursued by wildlife rangers. Chris followed the river all the way into Mexico, where he spent a few days in the village of El Golfo. With no way to support himself in a foreign country, he attempted to re-enter the US, where he was briefly detained due to a lack of ID. After he was released, he continued north, eventually ending up in South Dakota once again. He tracked down his friend Wayne and worked his old job for several more months, but this time he had a definitive plan to travel further north and live off the land in the new year. In the spring of 1992, he bid farewell to his friend once again and headed north, eventually ending up in Fairbanks, Alaska. While traveling, he adopted the alter ego of Alexander Supertramp and wrote a detailed description of this character in his journal. 2 years he walks the earth, no phone, no pool, no pets, no cigarettes. Ultimate freedom, an extremist, an aesthetic voyager whose home is now the road, escaped from Atlanta, thou shalt not return, 'cause the West is the best. And now after 2 rambling years comes the final and greatest adventure, the climactic battle to kill the false being within and victoriously conclude the spiritual revolution. 10 days of nights and freight trains and hitchhiking bring him to the great white north. No longer to be poisoned by civilization, he flees and walks alone upon the land to become lost in the wild. After hitchhiking to a remote village west of Fairbanks, Chris's final ride came from a local electrician named Jim Gallion. Gallion became very concerned when he heard Chris's plan to live in the wilderness with just the minimal equipment that he carried with him. Jim actually offered to drive him back into town and buy him new gear, but Chris quickly refused this offer. But he did accept Jim's rubber boots and a ham sandwich. At the end of a lonely dirt road, Gallion dropped off Chris and he disappeared into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Chris crossed a small stream known as the Teklenika River and continued onward following the Stampede Trail. After 3 days of hiking, he stumbled upon an old abandoned bus. The vehicle had been placed there in the 1960s to house construction workers who were set to complete a new road, but when the project fell through, the bus was abandoned. That bus became Chris's home for the next 4 months. Despite the shelter the bus provided, life was difficult. With such minimal supplies, Chris had to forage for food with his body weight slowly withering away. Though he had little success hunting, Chris did manage to kill a moose in June, but without adequate knowledge on how to preserve meat, most of the animal spoiled before he could eat it. In his journal, Chris wrote that killing that moose was the most tragic thing I've ever done. In July of 1992, Chris decided he was ready to return to civilization. He packed up his few belongings, tightened the belt around his now frail body, and set out on the Stampede Trail back the way he came. When he reached the Teklenika River, he made a frightening discovery. The river, which was just a small stream in April, had risen to a frightening level and it was no longer possible to cross on foot. Frightened and lonely, Chris turned around and began the dark walk back to the bus. In his own words, he was now trapped in the wild. Little did Chris know that just half a mile upstream, just out of eyeshot, was a cable crossing that he could have used to travel over top of the river, and a little further down from that was a log cabin stocked with fresh meat and other supplies. Chris arrived back at the bus and posted a desperate note that read, "Attention possible visitors, SOS, I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak to hike out of here. I am all alone and this is no joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. I am out collecting berries close by and shall return this evening." But the help never came. While we don't know for sure what happened in those final weeks, based on Chris's journal entries and extensive research by Into the Wild author John Krakauer, it's likely that in a desperate attempt to feed himself, Chris ate a poisonous wild plant that resembled an edible potato vine. The poison inhibited his ability to digest nutrients and led him to a slow and painful starvation inside that bus. Chris McCandless died on the 24th of August, 1992. Chris's bus remained in its place for years after his death, and it was often visited. It became a symbol of adventure and resilience. But over the years, visitors would sometimes become trapped in the area in the same way Chris had. Isn't that ironic? In 2010, someone actually drowned while attempting to cross the Teklenika. It got to the point where rangers in the area spent most of their time tracking down and rescuing visitors of the bus. Local authorities knew they needed a solution, and after much deliberation, the bus was airlifted and placed in the Museum of the North on the University of Alaska's campus, where it still sits today. There are a few factors that make Chris's story so tragic. The troubled relationship with his parents that pushed him down this path, the fact that he was so unknowingly close to salvation, but most of all, it's the evidence that he had a drastic change of heart near the end. During those fateful final weeks, Chris was reading a book called Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. There's a paragraph in that story that reads, "And so it turned out that only a life similar to the life of those around us, merging it without a ripple, is genuine life, and that an unshared happiness is not happiness." Beside that paragraph, in the last moments of his life, Chris scribbled the phrase, "Happiness only real when shared." This is particularly interesting because it goes so contrary to what we know of him. Chris was self-reliant and determined to live his own life, free from others. It seemed like he was terrified of getting too close to people. He would frequently spend a week or two with strangers he met along the way and then pack up and leave. But I think what he needed, and what he was actually searching for deep down, was connection to other people. It's just a shame that he realized this far too late. The reaction to Chris McCandless's life is extremely polarizing. On the one hand, people will hold him up as a hero, a savior, and a role model to those of us who crave an alternative lifestyle. On the other hand, some, usually those with some wilderness experience themselves, consider him to be an idiot who disrespected nature by improperly preparing, and ultimately, he got what he deserved. But like with most things, there's nuance to this situation. I believe the truth of Chris lies somewhere in the middle. Many people have a desire for adventure like Chris did. As the famous saying goes, most men live lives of quiet desperation. Now that we've entered an era where the typical workday involves sitting in a cubicle for 8 to 10 hours a day, this statement is more relevant than it's ever been. Chris McCandless believed this wholeheartedly, and to his credit, he had the courage to actually do something about his situation. So many of us are not content with our lives, and yet we refuse to actually change them. With that said, Chris didn't approach his adventure in a very diligent way. He was impulsive and failed to offer nature the respect that it demands. Nature can be a ruthless force, quick to take life without any feelings of remorse. Perhaps Chris McCandless's greatest strength was his ability to not care what people thought of him. He was unimpacted by the desires of his parents and the many people that he met through his travels. He would listen to what they had to say, smile politely, and then proceed to do whatever the hell he wanted to do. He also deeply valued new experiences, and that's something that really resonates with me on a personal level. In a letter to a friend, Chris wrote, "So many people live within unhappy circumstances and yet will not take the initiative to change their situation because they are conditioned to a life of security, conformity, and conservatism, all of which may appear to give one peace of mind, but in reality, nothing is more damaging to the adventurous spirit within a man than a secure future. The very basic core of a man's living spirit is his passion for adventure. The joy of life comes from our encounters with new experiences, and hence there is no greater joy than to have an endlessly changing horizon, for each day to have a new and different sun." Thanks for listening.